I just have this idea of him just like floating back and forth between these two spaces, the frontier and Northeast elite.
Yeah, and that the two are knitted together more than we might think about them. It isn't just that the nation is oriented west. There's a real interplay among the different sections during this period.
In 1874, he's in New York City, and he's both gambling, but also like gets into shorting stocks, and he loses $10,000, which is a lot of money. He's writing like columns in like the newspapers at the time. He's just sort of cosmopolitan.
He's on the lecture circuit.
Yeah, he's on the literally on the lecture circuit. Like he's like
he's
trying
doing
to
it all.
Hey, he's trying to hustle for like the $5,000 speaking gig, like we all are. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. It's 50 Weeks That Shaped America, our series on the major stories that shaped how we got here 250 years into this little experiment in democracy that we got going on. And this is week 24. So yeah, we are hurtling towards the 4th of July peak America 250. To be clear, listeners, we are going to keep going all year, well beyond 4th of July. And honestly, we may get to more than 50 weeks, but that's, it's a cleaner name if you just say 50 weeks. But this episode, this week, in two parts, we go to June 1876 to the Montana Territory and the Battle of Little Bighorn. Or is it Custer's Last Stand? Or is it the Battle of the Greasy Grass? And I guess that's a big part of this story. Depends on whose perspective you are taking. But this is indeed a battle that took place between the U.S. Army, led by George A. Custer, and combined forces of the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, commonly referred to as the Plains Indians. And the battle famously resulted in the defeat of U.S. forces. It turned Custer into a martyr and signaled a major turning point in the Sioux Wars and the westward expansion by the United States as they conquered Western territory and Native American tribes. After Little Bighorn, the story of Custer fueled ever more violent and aggressive policies towards Plains Indians. So, today we kick off a two-parter, what happened at Little Bighorn, but more importantly, the larger context of America in 1876, westward expansion, President Ulysses S. Grant, the great warrior myth, cinnamon-scented hair oil. We've got it all here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
The cinnamon-scented hair oil is what Custer would put in his hair?
Yes, it reminds me of like rosy-fingered Dawn or gray-eyed Athena as one of those epithets at the beginning that I will always think of him as cinnamon-scented Custer.
I mean, it sounds divine.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I'm not even gonna lie. I recently bought like a hair perfume, which I didn't realize there's such a thing as hair perfume. Okay. But it is nice to sort of like make a few sprays, then you run into it and like have it like gently waft your hair, and then you walk by and it just smells like,
yeah,
oh, that smells fantastic.
We haven't done too much of it in this show, but I think it's safe to say the past was pretty smelly. Right?
Yes, no question.
And so for someone out on the plains in 1876 to be doing the self-care, to have some cinnamon-scented hair oil, it fits.
Have a routine.
Yeah, have a routine, good for him. And it fits his personality, as we will get into. Yes. We will describe his personality. Before we do that, though, actually, very quickly, have either of you been out to this space? To where Little Bighorn took place?
I have.
Yeah?
I have. This was, years ago, maybe like at least 15 years ago. We were moving. We lived in North Dakota for about 4 years. And so we moved out to Spokane, Washington. And of course, you have to drive through Montana, which is the longest state ever. And we went through the lower sort of route of Montana. And it's on the way. And so it's kind of a cool place. I always like stopping by at like historical sites and things of that nature. But I actually have been. Montana's not a state that a lot of people, I think, put on their radar, but it's worth going to see.
Yeah, I haven't been, but there are some great national parks out there, so it is on my list for my next Western trip.
Yeah,
I've been to Montana a bunch. I've never been, and I want to go. But I was looking at photos of it this morning, and we'll talk a little bit about how the site itself is a little contested right now. But I was, I've been to Gettysburg, but funnily enough, I was in Scotland a number of years ago, and I went to this site where it was the Battle of Culloden, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, which was a battle in 1746 that ended the Jacobite Rising. And if listeners, if you think you're going to get confused by some of the warring factions in this story, just try and get your head around the Jacobite Rising of 1746. But anyway, I went to this Battle of Culloden Field, and it was one of the more like moving experiences of my life because it was set up, and it seems to me like the Little Bighorn National Monument is set up the same way. It's just very restrained, and it just lets you sort of walk the space. And there are like little gravestones marking it, and there's a little bit of guidance, but it doesn't put you in like dad history troop movement mode. It puts you in like a physical space where you sort of use your imagination and bring your kind of emotionality to it and say like, wow, like people had to trudge through this very ground right here. And, that ravine right there was the key defining factor, or like that swampy land or that river, as we'll discuss. But just something about leaving the space largely just like still was really moving for me.
Yeah, no, I get that. There's a lot of places where I feel like you can have those same sort of either emotional or visceral responses when it's done well, when it's really given a lot of thought as to how to sort of preserve the space, and to give people an opportunity to really just be mindful while they're there. I think that's really important because I have been to places where it either feels cheesy or constructed or fake.
Or like reenacted in some way.
Yeah. And I think you really want to, especially when it comes to a battlefield, you really want to avoid that kind of set presence where it feels like you're a part of some sort of show.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we will get into how this battle went down, some of the key characters, after we take a quick break. A reminder as we go into this break that those of you who are supporting the show by becoming paying subscribers to the newsletter also get advance ad-free access to all of our stuff, a bunch of bonus stuff that we're doing all this month and throughout the year. There's also a free version of the newsletter. So however you can get in on the newsletter community, help support the show, you can go to thisdaypod.com for all the information, thisdaypod.com. And of course, remember that we have a live show in Boston coming up on June 24th. So we hope we see some of you out there. That information as well on our website. Okay, we'll be right back. Okay, well, where to begin? And I think listeners know we don't subscribe to the great man theory of history here, certainly the great warrior man theory of history here, but I think we should start by describing two men. Apologies. But I do think it's very important to get our heads around who General Custer was and then talk about Sitting Bull and a little bit about Crazy Horse as well. But especially with Custer, part of the story is he's been reduced to such a, kind of flat historical figure with this last stand mythology, but he was actually much more complex, lived a much more colorful life in a way that I think really helps us understand this era and what this era's long-term impact on American history was. But aside from the cinnamon, or maybe you want to start with the cinnamon oil in his hair. Where do you want to start, Kelly?
I mean, sure. Let's start with cinnamon. I mean, this is a man who I'll say cared very deeply about how he looked, how he presented himself. He was often teased for that. His nicknames often came from the way that he looked. He had sort of long, blonde, curly hair, ringlets, and so people called him Ringlets as a nickname. His wife teased him for washing his hands too much, which I was like, hey, it's the 19th century. Right. You cannot get on anyone for washing their hands too much. But also he brushed his teeth after every meal. Like he really cared about presentation. And so sort of like scenting his hair with perfume was just another part of the way that like he adorned himself or in some ways, I guess, displayed his own power or his own ability to sort of like show up in a space and let people know that he was ready to lead. The problem with his leadership, I mean, really, he gets sort of pitted as this cautionary tale. Like, that's how I came to understand Custer. It's like, one, his name is associated with the last stand. So you know it doesn't go well for him in the end. And part of that, I think, is because he is this impulsive, brash person, kind of foolish, kind of prideful, kind of I know best type of personality. And so it gets him in a lot of trouble. But when he's successful, it endears a lot of people to his persona. So he has this charisma attached to him.
Yes.
But when he's making these big decisions, he oftentimes, it's a gamble, and he was actually a gambler, about whether or not he could be successful. Sometimes he oversold things. Sometimes he got him way over his head. And you see that persona, I think, coming out again and again. He was also...
Not just in war, right? I mean, we'll get into this, but just in all of his other dealings, right? I mean,
throughout all of his life.
Yeah.
I think part of the fact, too, is that he is amplified so quickly. I mean, he attends West Point. He's the last in his class. But just as he's graduating, the Civil War breaks out. They need leaders. So he sort of rushed to the head of the line when it comes to leadership. I mean, he becomes a general age 23. Like, that's impossible today. Like, there's no way that you could sort of skip the line in that kind of way. But he's referred to as the boy general. And so having to lead so soon, I think, is also part of his persona. And, you know, if he came to this later in life, or he's in his 40s, maybe he's a little wiser, maybe he's a little bit more sort of experienced. And I think that youth does contribute a lot to some of his impulsive behavior.
Right. No, his brain isn't fully formed yet when he's doing all of this. He's
a 23-year-old boy.
Right. And it's so interesting because you get the sense that this is someone who is thinking about his image and is thinking about his legend in this period in which the military is sort of the path to myth making around men in the United States. And so, you know, he doesn't thrive at West Point, but he does really excel at this impression making that is going to be so important to why we still talk about him.
And he also, time and time again, from my read on things, benefits sort of by default. And I wouldn't call it necessarily failing up, but like there are so many moments where like the path just sort of opens up in front of him by other circumstance. And so like he's last in his class at West Point, as we said, and then the war breaks out and they just need people and he becomes a general. Later on in life, I think that's one of the many ways, that's sort of one of the ways in which he ended up on sort of leading things on the plains, was because other people who might have been in that position kind of had other things going on. So, you know, it's definitely one of those lives. You skipped over, though, one of my favorite parts of his personality, which is, he was a good athlete. He was 5'11", like 150, you know, but he apparently could jump from his lying on his back onto his feet, do one of those get-ups, which is like really impressive. But then he also was famous for being able to take power naps, like these incredibly short, small naps. Basically, immediately after lying down, he would fall asleep for like a second or two and wake up and then just like be refreshed. And he referred to himself as a power sleeper. And I can do that. And it is, I think, my greatest and like most valuable skill. No, it's crazy. I can literally close my eyes for like 5 seconds and reset my, like, it feels to me like I'm resetting my brain. Like I'm hitting the power off, power on button and I'm good to go.
How many hours of sleep do you get?
I get a lot of, no, I love sleeping. It's my favorite thing in the world. I get a lot of sleep. But like when I need to take a nap, it's sometimes literally like 15 seconds and it works.
That is very impressive. Can you do the jumping thing?
No, I can't do the jumping thing. I've tried. But could he touch rim? Could he touch rim on a basketball? Could he dunk a tennis ball in his sophomore year of college? Because I could. I don't know if he could. Yeah,
and he apparently has quite a vertical.
Yeah.
I'm saying if he can jump from lane,
he probably could. Okay, fine.
I'm gonna give it to
fine.
him.
General Custer was a better athlete than me. I'm gonna just shut up for the rest of this
But he
podcast.
could not guess the name of a New Yorker cover. Never did it once in his life.
Fair enough. Okay, so he is in the Civil War and he's at Gettysburg, and he is. You know, his cavalry do help defeat Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg, and so he gets some. It burnishes his reputation. What's his life like kind of coming out of the Civil War? And again, like so much of this story, it's the thing that I'm most fascinated in exploring. It's like the post-Civil War side of this story is looms so large, including for the individuals like him who are coming off of this war and getting up to other stuff.
I mean, it's interesting to me. He's a Democrat. So he would have been... obviously he's a general for the Union, but at the same time, his political leanings or affiliations would have made him very much aligned with someone like Andrew Johnson. It would have put him in a position where he was sympathetic, shall we say, to maybe the Southern cause. And I think this is interesting for a lot of reasons, because when you think of like Union generals, you tend to think that they are sort of on the right side of history, or people that are a little bit more proactive about civil rights and things of that nature. Grant has that persona, Sherman, certainly. But the way he lives his post-Civil War life is very much antagonistic to Native Americans. And I mean, he spends the rest of his career pretty much either trying to make money or trying to get success in the frontier.
Yeah. He is sent to sort of the Reconstruction South. We've done episodes about Reconstruction, but he's sent there to sort of command troops that are trying to enforce Reconstruction. But then you do get this sense that part of him is also okay with the way that Reconstruction starts to fall apart and a little bit of the white backlash in the years, so as we get into the 1870s.
And it's kind of interesting to use him to trace U.S. military redeployment after the war.
Yes.
Because you do have federal troops who are stationed in the South, at least until 1876. But they're also being redeployed west in order to, continue to expand white settlement and engage with the native tribes.
Yeah, I mean, he's in Louisiana and Texas one year, then he's off to Kansas for another. Then he gets suspended for a year because he left his command to go visit his wife, which is a nice little touch, I guess. They had a very fascinating relationship. And then, he then starts to get roped into, in the late 1860s, into the campaigns against the Cheyenne out on the frontier. And we should briefly mention, in November of 1868, there's the Battle of Washita. And, we could do a whole episode on this. There's tons of in-depth reporting and reconstruction about what happened there. But, by all accounts, it was extremely vicious, and Custer's soldiers killed not just, Cheyenne, but women and children, in addition to warriors. They shot most of the 875 Indian ponies they had captured. We bring it up just to mention that there is a kind of element of like ruthlessness and inhumanity that we see, and annihilation that we see under him. Yeah.
And it doesn't make sense. I mean, then and now, it did not make sense to kill women and children. When you're engaging with warriors, that's one thing. But, these civilians' lives are just being slaughtered. It didn't even make sense practically to kill 875 ponies. It's like, couldn't you have used those horses? I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me either. But the idea that it is just about annihilation, and that is meant to sort of not just show power, but further, I think, threaten other tribes to show we will sort of wipe you out, even your resources. We don't need them. We will dispose of them. I think, you see it happen with the buffalo as well. It's just like,
yes,
slaughter to the point of like, we're not using this for meat. We're not using this to feed the troops. We're just trying to annihilate.
And we should say that it's not as though Custer is inventing this on the spot. I mean, this had been the kind of rules of engagement of the U.S. military when it came to indigenous tribes. I think it was in 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre was the same kind of thing, where it was just wiping out a village of old men and women and children, because part of what they're doing, right, as we'll talk about, is ethnic cleansing. They're clearing out native tribes from the West in order to take over that land.
Though, let's keep our eye on this, but something in the 1870s starts to also shift, and things get more vicious. And I think a lot of that has to do, as we'll discuss, with the kind of discovery of gold and so forth. But, there is definitely, as we head towards the Battle of Little Bighorn, the policy and the tactics do kind of ratchet up and ratchet up and ratchet up as we go through into the 1870s. So one other thing about just sort of where Custer is on the map and in his own personal journey as we get into the 1870s, there is this interesting dynamic where, and it happens even in 1876, in the specific year that we're going to discuss where the battle takes place, he's always seems to be also be going back east and getting up to stuff and then going out to the frontier and going back east. And, he's playing a political game in many ways too. He's going back and he's sort of playing Grant, and we'll talk about Sheridan's role in all of this as well. But, he's sort of playing the politics of it all, but also I think really engaging in a kind of new Northeastern based, for lack of a better term, media environment in which he can sort of paint a picture of himself and burnish his own reputation and craft a story, as you were saying, Kelly. But he always seems to be I just have this idea of him just floating back and forth between these two spaces, the frontier and Northeast elite.
Yeah, and that the two are knitted together more than we might think about them. And we've done episodes on how the railroad is expanding into this area and connecting these places, but it isn't just that the nation is oriented west. There's a real interplay among the different sections during this period.
In 1874, he's in New York City, and he's both gambling, but also like gets into shorting stocks, and he loses $10,000, which is a lot of money. He's writing like columns in like the newspapers at the time, not like the Atlantic, but that kind of newspaper at the time. He's just sort of cosmopolitan.
He's on the lecture circuit.
Yeah, he's on the literally on the lecture circuit. He's trying
doing it all.
He's trying to hustle for like the $5,000 speaking gig, like we all are. It's funny, he's just much more cosmopolitan, I think, than maybe that legend would imply.
But he's also everywhere in sort of like this Forrest Gump kind of way, where he's like in Chicago after the Great Fire, and he like escorts the Grand Duke of Alexis of Russia on a buffalo hunt. It's like, how are you in all these places?
He does surveying for railroad companies.
Kansas and then Chicago and then New York. Like he's all over the map.
Yeah.
He's got his frequent flyer miles.
Yes, he does. So let's add another element to this story as well, which is, of course, as I mentioned, gold is discovered. So in the summer of 74, the New York Times publishes a report from Custer describing how they have started to find gold throughout the Black Hills. This, of course, leads tons of miners to show up into the area, and it leads, the U.S. government to look at some of those treaties that they started to cut and say, well, maybe this isn't the most beneficial now that we have found gold throughout this region. So it's hard to understate or overstate how much that is a huge point of tension in this.
Its tale as old as time. I mean, in almost every single sort of native historical moment where there's gold, where there's oil, where there's some sort of resource, water, right? Like all of that gets seized quickly. And then every single promise or treaty just instantly becomes null and void. Whether you would sign that treaty or not, as we'll talk about later, but like whether you are an active participant in engaging some of these negotiations or whether you refuse, like the United States is predatory when it comes to taking advantage of resources that it thinks belongs to it.
Yeah. And this idea that native sovereignty is a fiction, right? That when the U.S. sees something it wants in those sovereign lands, it just takes it and ignores the treaties it signs.
So it is this Black Hills expedition that is sort of puts Custer out on the frontier in 74, 75, heading into 76, though, as we'll discuss, he's also dipping back east throughout those years as well. Do either of you want to say a word about, Grant as president? Just worth placing him in the picture here. And then I also think it's worth pointing out that there are a number of also ex-Civil War generals who are part of this as well, including Philip Sheridan, I think one of the more famous Union generals. He plays a huge part in this as well, as we'll discuss. But, he is like, in many ways, Grant's right-hand man and sort of like at the helm of developing a lot of this military strategy, both on the frontier and in the sort of Reconstruction South.
Yeah, I mean, Grant, I was a little bit sympathetic towards his presidency because he can't really catch a break. I mean, he comes off of the war and then he's literally fighting these two battles in the South and in the West. And he's not the best leader to do those things. He's sort of weak on enforcement and also heavy-handed when it comes to native destruction. And so you see that there's like this interesting, dichotomy of trying to carve out and create Black freedom and enfranchisement and to like send troops to protect voting rights for Black men. And at the same time, in the same moment, which I think often gets overlooked because Reconstruction is so like of the moment, you have these violent campaigns that are taking place. And we don't put a lot of the blood on the hands of people like Grant, and perhaps we should. Lincoln included. He's also fighting these battles during the Civil War.
Yeah.
And we don't discuss those things in tandem.
Yeah, I think Lincoln oversees the execution of a large number of native men.
Yeah, we've done an episode on that in the Lakota, yes. Okay, let's sort of pan the camera over now and talk about what's happening with the Plains Indians. So we've put one of our main characters on the map, General Custer, and now let's talk about Sitting Bull and a little bit about Crazy Horse as well.
Well, as Kelly was just saying, these two things, the war and Reconstruction and treaty making and war making against Native tribes, they're all happening at the same time. Throughout the Civil War, there are fights happening both with Confederate and U.S. aligned tribes and then tribes who are non-aligned, who are also coming into battle with the U.S. military and the Confederate military. In 1865, as the war is coming to an end, a congressional committee begins to study these uprisings and wars in the American West. A couple of years later, they come out with a report on the condition of the Indian tribes, which is all about trying to set up a peace commission so that they can begin to find stability in the West, right? There's with slavery ended, the thing that was acting as a damper on westward expansion has gone. Right now, you don't have to negotiate. Is it a free state or a slave state, a free territory or a slave territory? Now all eyes are west. And now you have to resolve this issue of war making and peacemaking with Native tribes.
Yeah.
So coming out of this peace conference, you end up in 1868, a conference that's held at Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming. And it brings together all of these tribes that are part of the Sioux Nation and the Arapaho. And they work out this treaty where the Sioux and the Arapaho agree to give up some land and to relocate to the Black Hills in the Dakota Territory, a place I'm sure you're very familiar with, Kelly. All of the tribes involved, they give up tons of land that they had been promised in earlier treaties, but they do retain hunting and fishing rights to those territories. So they can still move freely on that land. They can still use that land in order to have this more nomadic hunting lifestyle. And they agree, okay, we're not going to attack the railroads. We're not going to attack the settlers. And in exchange, they're going to get what is known as the Great Sioux Reservation. And most importantly, this new reservation, which is like half the state of what would become the state of South Dakota, includes the Black Hills, which is really, really important because that is a sacred site for many of these tribes. And so it's important that that remains under their control. And it's that set of conditions, this Fort Laramie Treaty, that begins to sort of fracture, at least ideologically, the Lakota Nation between people who are okay with the treaty or think this is the best we're going to get and the people who are opposed to the treaty. And the person who is the head of the group opposed to the treaty is Sitting Bull.
Yeah, so I think that's really important to understand that he is really, I mean, he gathers an enormous amount of people in this section, but you know, that is the sort of main divide here, is just basically who is taken on the treaty and who is extremely skeptical still.
And I feel like such a good metaphor for like how politics even play out today, right? The people who are kind of like pragmatic politics, like, listen, just take the deal and maybe they'll go away. And those who are constantly actively trying to resist, the stripping away of agency.
Yeah. And the truth is, if you are in that anti-treaty side of things, you want someone like Sitting Bull as the leader of this movement. He was born to a prominent Hunkpapa Lakota family sometime in the 1830s. And he had, at a pretty young age, not unlike Custer, built a real reputation within the tribe as a hunter, as a warrior, but also as a spiritual leader. He's somebody who, by the age of 30, was seen as a holy man among the Lakota. And he disagreed with the Laramie Treaty. He told one of the missionaries who was sent by the government, "I wish all to know that I do not propose to sell any part of my country." They felt like they'd given up enough, and now they were going to keep the land that they had. And so he doesn't agree to stop attacking settlers and railroad agents. Those fights continue into the late 60s and early 70s. And they do get sort of a reprieve, in part because in 1873, there's this big panic in the U.S. And as we talked about in our Transcontinental Railroad episode, there's a real lag in building that's going on during those years as all of the funding falls out.
Yeah. So I think one really important thing to kind of have in mind about Sitting Bull is, we talked about how Custer is like a political animal in many ways. And I think it's important to know that Sitting Bull is as well. Like Sitting Bull knows about the panic of 1873. He is constantly negotiating, this sort of state of U.S. policy and his needs, and both militarily and politically. And so both of these figures are just like constantly negotiating basically the politics that are being decided and the economic picture that's being decided out east.
And for Sitting Bull, it's more than just about his own reputation, but like the survival of his people are at stake, or Custer's sort of like, I'm just trying to make a big name. It's like, no, I'm trying to save a people. Like I'm trying to protect what is left of his nation. And it's no small job, especially when there are factions even within native tribes about how to do that and to do it well.
And he has an excellent ally in Crazy Horse. And we don't need to do a full history of Crazy Horse, but he's also Lakota. He was born in 1841 to the Lakota Oglala Band. But he also gains this reputation as a brash warrior who's willing to take big risks, who takes part in raids with Sitting Bull. He refuses to attend the Laramie Treaty signing like Sitting Bull. And they're both Lakota chiefs. And they're both part of this generation where they grew up knowing white contact, like they'd had contact with Europeans, but it was before the era where white settlement had completely undone their ancestral ways. And so they're this transition generation that is probably the last generation that is able to wield a level of political power that forces the U.S. to reckon with them.
So T.J. Stiles has written a really masterful biography of Custer, and his main argument is that Custer is just a figure who kind of stands astride two worlds. This is, stands between the kind of modern America and a previous time, and he's kind of constantly negotiating this sort of the rapid changes of the era. And I think we could see that with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse as well. That like everyone in this story is just in this era, in the post-Civil War, like the U.S. is just changing so rapidly on a political front, technological front, and everyone is trying to negotiate that. So what starts to happen in late 1875? Of course, we mentioned that gold had been discovered a year or two before. There's a lot of pressure from out east to send Custer and other expeditions out there to, survey the land, but also start to renegotiate some of these treaties. By, my read on it, it is General Sheridan, who was a Civil War veteran, who was kind of at the heart of like concocting a lot of these schemes that frankly just like broke a lot of the treaties and were pretty duplicitous. And there's even like reporting that he was kind of like forging letters and sort of playing both sides. But, so Sheridan is really at the, like, I think really being very aggressive about trying to go into the Black Hills and seize the land and drive the people out. And he is the one who kind of concocts this idea going into 1876 to basically make one final offer to the Sioux to buy the Black Hills region. When they refuse, they're ordered to go to reservations by the end of January 1876. Now, that's just like bad planning because who's going to move around in the dead of winter of 1876? So that's actually what pushes this story a little bit more towards the summer, is the fact that like they had set this ridiculous deadline of like, hey, everyone go to a reservation by the end of January. Well, that's not possible. And so now you just...
As someone who has lived in North Dakota, those winters
You're not moving around.
Brutal. Never have I felt cold like that in my entire life, when it was negative 33 and like nothing shut down. Everyone was like, yeah, we're going to work. What do you mean? Like, I mean, the idea of having to move thousands of people, the elderly, children, thousands of miles too. I mean, hundreds of miles. We're not talking about like, small moves here. It's just completely untenable. But it also speaks to the idea of like, this should work for you. This is fine, right? You guys are always on the move.
Take it or leave it. Yeah. But it is, then of course into the spring and the summer of 1876 where all of this starts to then ratchet up. The Sitting Bull is like gathered thousands and thousands of people. In June of 76, the Lakotas and Cheyenne have a Sundance together. Sitting Bull is there. And at the same time, Custer and his regiment and other troops are starting to enter the area as well. And they will, of course, meet in late June of 76. I want to add one other thing that is happening in the summer of 76 before we then take a break. And next episode, we'll get into the battle itself. But we've been saying it over and over. 1876, 1876. Do some math, folks. 1876 is, of course, the centennial of the United States. So this is our chance a little bit to talk about, we've talked about the bicentennial. We, of course, here at the semi-quincentennial. But what is happening in 1876 with the centennial, 100 years? Well, they were trying to celebrate as well. And they were trying to kind of craft a story of America in the same way that we saw at the bicentennial and that we're seeing this year. And like in many of those other years, the vibes are a little rocky, right? Obviously, it's the wake of the Civil War, but we talked about the Panic of 1873. People are still kind of licking their wounds from that. And so I think the powers that be see 1876 and the centennial, especially the Centennial International Exhibition, which is going to take place in Philadelphia, as a real like showcase for this country, and in particular a showcase for like American industry and expansion. And so you get like this big centennial exhibition where in Grant's speech that opens it, he says, you know, he gives a big, long speech about the history of this country and so forth. He says, our achievements have been great enough to make it easy for our people to acknowledge superior merit wherever we are found. So there's definitely a little element there of like manifest destiny. We are the chosen ones.
Yes.
And there is a lot of like celebration of the wonders of the industrial age. And so there's all sorts of new technologies and machines on display. But there's also, at this time, the Smithsonian's director, Joseph Henry, had planned to stage a living display of several hundred Native Americans, basically a like museum of natural history diorama brought to life. Yeah. And it didn't really work out as hostilities in the West kind of ratcheted up. So they do gather as many Native American artifacts as possible. And they say it's going to, quote, present savage life and conditions in all grades and places. So, you know, this exhibit that's happening in Philly in the summer of 76 is just such a like stark example of kind of how the U.S. is telling itself a story about itself in that moment.
And not just a story, right? They're selling something between a hope and propaganda, because the things that they're highlighting, technology, industry, and the West, are places of deep contest and division. Like, people are being immiserated by the dawn of the industrial era. But here is a chance to focus on, we're paying a high price for this, but we're creating a better world. And I think there's something about the presentation of the West as well that is part of that like there's a rocky road ahead, but there's a promised land waiting on the other side. And I think that's part of the work that the Centennial is doing in a pretty fraught moment.
I'm starting to think that these celebrations are really problematic.
Yeah, you don't say.
Really, really contested. I mean, no one has been able to like do it well for the whole year. You might have some here and there, but like, I feel like there's too much pressure. I feel like maybe we just celebrate like some random, like, I don't know, 243 or something like that. Like, it just is every time I think you try to get consensus or you try to get like a narrative that feels all encompassing. I mean, it continually falls short because, well, one, this country is not perfect, but also because like it's just impossible to try to encapsulate everything you want America to be by a certain time frame, and then put a bow on it and then sort of blow out the candles. It's impossible.
It also provides, and I think there's a problematic side to this as well, these like this pressure, these hooks, these kind of like desire to like, we got to do something big. And that is, I'm going to end here by pointing out that is a huge part of this story as well on two fronts. So one, we talked about how there's all this, there's these two fronts that Grant and the sort of northern elite, political elite, are trying to navigate. And by all accounts, Sheridan is really kind of like focused on what's happening with the Reconstruction and the Reconstruction falling apart. And so in many ways, he sends Custer out west because he just has to really focus on what's happening in the South. But moreover, Custer by all accounts, visits Philadelphia and visits the sort of like preparations for this centennial exhibit in like the spring of 76. And he basically tells himself and tells others like, hey, I'm going to go out to the Black Hills and I'm going to beat those guys, and I'm going to be back here for peak 4th of July, and I'm going to ride in triumphantly with a story of having defeated the Plains Indians. And so, there's part of this story you can absolutely see, and the sort of reckless behavior that we see on the part of Custer as being driven a little bit by a desire to come back and give one of those $5,000 paid speaking engagements, on July 3rd at the Centennial Exhibition.
And plotting out the image in advance, right? He already sees himself riding into the Centennial Exhibition as a victor, and he is now going to work to try to make that a reality.
Yeah. And it does not. And we will talk about how it does not next year. Next episode, we will talk about the kind of myth of Custer that comes out of it and how it has been contested over the years and how that contested myth really reflects shifting ideas in this country in the many years since. But that is all for next episode in part 2 as we get into Custer's last stand, the Battle of Little Bighorn. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. It is 50 weeks that shaped America. This is part 2 of our look at the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of the Greasy Grass, as it has been referred to over the years. We are in June of 1876 in the Montana Territory. Last episode, we got to know 2 of the main figures at the heart of this, General Custer, and on the other side, leading the Plains Indians, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse as well. And we kind of placed them in the Montana Territory in the spring and summer of 76. Back east, of course, is the centennial celebrations going on. And we ended last episode pointing out that General Custer had a little bit of incentive to try and win this battle and ride back east to the centennial celebrations victorious and maybe give one of those speeches where he gets to proclaim himself a great American hero. This episode, we will talk about how, of course, that does not happen and the many very interesting fallout in the time and in the many decades since from this story. So here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Okay, before we get into troop movements and strategic decisions, and we won't go too deep in the weeds on that, I do have a big question for the two of you that I would love to hear your thoughts on. And we touched on it a little bit, but obviously, like, the centennial context here is important, and the westward expansion and the railroads and the fallout from the Panic of 1873 is important here. But this is also very much a post-Civil War hangover from the Civil War story as well. And so many of these figures fought in the Civil War. And maybe this is a slightly kind of naive question, but why is it that so many generals and politicians who fought for the North and fought a war that was ostensibly about dismantling a system of racial hierarchy in the South are now so willing to go out west and fight, a racially driven war of genocide against the native peoples?
It's a really good question. And I think part of it is we have to take apart the way that we understand race and the way people have been minoritized and how people thought about it at the time. I think for many Americans, they thought very differently about enslaved Black people and about Native Americans. They just didn't understand them in the same way. They played different roles in their universe of labor and rights and sovereignty. And so for many white Americans, they wouldn't have connected the struggle over slavery with the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans in the West. And Kelly can expand on this, I think, most Northern generals weren't fighting to end white supremacy.
I was just going to say that. They were like, white supremacy? What is that? From their perspective, this is about, a wayward South that has tried to, sort of turn its back on its nation, and they're bringing it back into the fold. This is not really about race or racism for them. This is more about no, this is for the Union. This is to save the country. And Black people are a part of that story, but they're not thinking about them in terms of ethics and morality and and I think that, and I also think that even for the ones who were against the institution of slavery, they still were not didn't have any issue with like the exploitation of Black labor. Like slavery might be bad, but once slavery's over, that exploitation of labor still continues, and that's not shunned. And it's not shunned against Black people. It's not shunned against white immigrants who come into the country, and it's certainly not shunned against Native Americans who haven't been exploited in terms of their labor, but are seen as an obstruction to labor,
Yes.
like an obstruction in the same way that's like, well, we need to expand and we need railroads, and you're in the way of that. And so that is how I think people are sort of making sense of this. But I have not seen a whole lot of activists in this moment, abolitionists, radical Republicans, who are talking about like Native sovereignty and morality and ethics in that way. For Black people, yeah, a little bit, but there's even limits on that. So I don't think it is something that got sort of a movement or a motion as to people who were in opposition to what was happening.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the Republican Party, and I'm not expert on this period, but its motto as it's forming in the 1850s is free soil, free labor, free men. And free labor touches on the slavery issue. Free men touches on the slavery issue. Free soil was about expansion. And that did not seem to cause a conflict in the hearts of Republicans over the fact that somebody else had a claim to that land.
Yeah. So as we've discussed, as we head into 74, 75, into 76, there's a lot more pressure, especially because they want to take over land because they have now started to get a sense that there's gold there. A lot of these treaties are getting torn up, or there's a lot of extremely duplicitous behavior on the part of people like former Union commander Philip Sheridan. But it is Custer who is out there in the Black Hills, and it is Custer who is roaming around with the 7th Cavalry in May, June of 1876. So we're going to there are, podcasts like many great battles. There are podcasts that go very deep into all of the movements and the number of troops and the bluffs and the rivers and the decisions minute by minute. We're going to do a fairly brief version of what happens on June 25th and 26th of 1876. But Custer has split his about 700 men into 3 groups, and they're kind of like, There's 3 different sort of U.S. Army groups sort of converging on where Sitting Bull has his main gathering. And it's kind of like, think of it like a T, So one's coming from the east, one's coming from the west, and one's coming from the south, and they're trying to converge. There's a general by the name of Reno, who is another really important figure in this, and who also kind of in some ways takes the fall for this. But he is going to attack from the south. Custer swings up to the north, coming from the east. And when they start to get a sense of how big this village that they're trying to do a surprise attack on is, it's much bigger than expected. So they are thinking they're going to encounter maybe a few hundred Plains Indians, and instead it's closer to 7,000 people, 2,000 warriors. But that means, a city, a huge village full of women and children and, kind of complex ecosystem that they've encountered. It is not a roving band of warriors as maybe they would have expected.
No, not at all. And I think by the fact that they split their forces, so in some military strategy, that might have been seen as like a good idea. Like, oh yeah, you take this side, I'll take this side, and we'll attack and sort of meet up in the middle. And when you realize that, like, now you don't have 700 soldiers. Now you've got 250, or you have 300, or you have, a couple hundred, and you're going up against 2,000 warriors. And not for nothing, but even the women are not like holding back when they see that their village is being attacked. And so your forces are even more splintered, and it makes it all but impossible for you to have some sort of victory. Maybe there would have been a fighting chance if they had all stayed as one unit, or maybe the fight would have lasted a little longer. They still would have died, I think, but it wouldn't have been over so quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the numbers were against them. And like on paper, you can understand, and this actually happens in the reverse direction later, but the encircling idea is a sound one, right? Like there's nowhere to escape. But when you're outnumbered and when you don't have the element of surprise, then you're in bad shape. And the thing is, Custer knew he had neither of those. He had scouts who came back to tell him the size of the encampment and that it was much larger than he was expecting. And he also just decides to attack in the middle of the day, which, later reports from Native people who were there, they were surprised that the attack was happening because they were like, who would be dumb enough to attack right now?
Yeah.
It's like pride. It goes before the fall.
Yeah. So Marcus Reno, who is commandeering one of these smaller groups, sort of leads the first attack, which crosses a river, comes down off a bluff, crosses a river, and basically stalls out immediately. Plains Indians warriors rush out to meet him. He forms a skirmish line, and then he immediately starts to retreat, and they start to scramble up the bluffs of the river. And so the sort of topography to keep in mind is that there's a number of rivers. The Little Bighorn is a river. And then there are a lot of these kind of bluffs. And, scrambling up them is very difficult. And then when you get to the top of them, you're sort of exposed. So that's the kind of stuff to keep in mind as the day of June 25th goes on. But the group that Reno is commandeering is sort of neutralized. They're in retreat. And that means that many of the Plains warriors can now focus on Custer, who is kind of moving north along the bluff and descends down towards the river. And he gets within several hundred yards of the village, but he never makes it across the river to actually confront the village itself. Instead, Indian warriors encircle his command from multiple directions. They start to fall back towards higher ground, and about 40 men make what then becomes known as the last stand on what then becomes known as Custer Hill. But they're now at the sort of top of this bluff, and they are surrounded, overwhelmed at the top of this bluff. And all of them are killed within minutes. And it is worth pointing out that all of this goes down in about 2 hours or so. I mean, this is really very fast.
That's very fast. I mean, there's not a lot of time to pivot, recover, retreat.
It goes haywire very quickly.
Yes, right. Very, very, very quickly. And that should have also been predictable. But and I also think that when you see how outnumbered you are, your morale, your courage, your ability to be able to fight is also sort of squandered.
It's about, I don't think that I realized before this how quickly it all happened, because you think about, I think we're used to talking about battles like the Battle of Gettysburg, which takes place over the course of several days. And here it doesn't even seem like much of a battle. It just falls to pieces so quickly.
Well, so I was wondering if we could do a little kind of go from one side of the history to another and do a little compare and contrast between basically the way the story gets told from the U.S. perspective and the way the story has been told from the Indian perspective. And so part of it gets at what you were just saying there, Nikki, that from the U.S. perspective, there's no hiding that this was a defeat, but it definitely is told as a much more kind of strategic, traditional kind of battle in which there's an attempt to attack, there's a retreat, and then there's a kind of encircling by native tribes of the final group of 40 heroic men who are then eventually defeated. When you hear this story from the native perspective, there's no real last stand. It's just kind of chaos and Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull's forces just kind of overwhelm and run roughshod. And some warriors have described it as feeling like a buffalo drive. And others have said, we circled around them and we swirled like water around a stone. But it wasn't this kind of heroic standoff at the end. It was just chaotic.
Well, the U.S. needs that narrative, though. They need to be able to show that they sort of went down standing up, that they were still in formation.
Died with their boots on.
Yes, died with their boots on. This idea that even Custer, I feel is sort of given this heroic end where it's he did all that he could to sort of, stand up to them or put up a fight, a valiant fight. And that just does not happen. And Americans like their war heroes. They like their generals to be seen as victorious. And even when they fail, people still want to see them in this sort of haloed light of having done something remarkable. Well, it was against all odds and they still, there's always that storyline out there.
I think also, I mean, that you mentioned, Kelly, that the U.S. story is that these men were in formation and they were holding the line and there was a clear leadership structure. There is something really important to the U.S. of the story, that it is a civilized force against the native warriors. And I think that that's part of that insistence that there was something structured about the U.S. fighting, because it's tied to those ideas of a civilized fight.
Yeah. And, many of the Indian accounts just, paint it as much more chaotic. They talk about soldiers just throwing down their guns and running away and being confused. There's also just sort of, as the Custer myth gets built up over the months and then decades, there's this idea that, everyone knew who Custer was and he was targeted. And, from the Indian perspective, a lot of the stories are like, we didn't know who this person was. We didn't identify his body until much later. Part of that is because Custer, going into this battle, had shaved his head. So we talked about his cinnamon-scented locks and how much he cared about those long curly locks. But he also suffered from a little male pattern baldness going into, this era. And so whether it was because he was sort of preparing for battle or because of his vanity, he had actually shaved his head just ahead of this. So this idea that like Custer was out there on the plains and he was this gallant, striking figure who everyone knew was like the head of this force and then was targeted in this brave last stand. They may not have even known who he was. And it was so chaotic. And there were just horses and gunfire and people running everywhere and falling over each other.
There's something very powerful in a Samson and Delilah kind of way.
Yeah,
Of, he's gotten rid of his hair.
He cuts his hair and loses his strength. Yeah, he could have worn a hat.
Many a man has.
I know.
There is, some evidence in Cheyenne oral tradition that credits Buffalo Calf Road Woman as the person who struck the blow that knocked Custer off his horse before he died. But, there is no final word. Custer's final words are a note he says, basically saying, send more reinforcements. That's the last kind of official record of anything he says. There's no, staged, gallant final moment for Custer in the way that many of the U.S. accounts would portray. And the flip side to that account of a brave last stand Custer is, of course, also, well, who screwed up here? And, from U.S. accounts, it's just really redounds to this blame game. And a lot of that blame does fall on Marcus Reno, who we'll talk about kind of what happens to him and his legacy. But, it's worth pointing out that when Native peoples tell this story, they are not talking about who screwed up on the U.S. side. They're talking about our defense of our territory in this moment.
Can I add one little fun fact? And I don't know if this is a fun fact. This is actually kind of a sad fact. But Custer not only loses his life, but Custer's nephew also dies. His brother-in-law is also killed in this battle, and two of his younger brothers also die in this battle. And so, I mean, you're talking about 4 or 5 family members that are all wiped out in this battle as well. And we often forget that a lot of family members are fighting alongside. I mean, we talk about Civil War, brother versus brother, but this being a soldier was sort of like not the factory job, but it was a job that a lot of people did collectively. You served alongside your literal brothers and your nephews and your cousins. And so the idea that they're all together, I thought was just an interesting addition to the story.
In the end, 268 Americans are killed. Native Americans lose about 30 to 100 people, and there are dozens of non-combatants as part of that as well. So after this defeat, we talked about how a lot of attention is back in Philadelphia as the centennial is on its way. And it is actually on July 6th, 1876, 2 days after the U.S.'s 100th birthday, the nation receives news, word makes its way back east of Custer's defeat. And General Sherman and General Sheridan are attending the Centennial exhibition, and they get the news on site at this event. And, almost immediately, it's kind of stunning, but the myth of Custer just starts to get written in real time. And I can't help but think the fact that it's people are processing it literally at the nation's 100th birthday celebration has a huge part in that.
Everyone's involved in this collective act of myth making, and here lands this story that is ripe for, creating a legend. it centers on a man who had been creating a legend around himself for years at this point. And so, yes, you absolutely immediately get writers and poets and politicians and painters. Everyone is trying to top one another in talking about the glory of Custer's heroism in this last moment. And I'll read from magazine editor Ian Stannard.
This is good.
It's very good because I'll read it and then we can talk about why it's good. He wrote about Custer, pure as a virgin, frank and open-hearted as a child, opposed to the use of tobacco, liquors, and profane language, free from political corruption, cool and courageous in the midst of the fiercest battle. He has left to us the model of a Christian warrior.
Snap. That's how you want to be written about. That's how you want it to go down, regardless if that's true or not.
I think it's so different from the kind of masculine, rough around the edges, like soldier mercenary image that we have today, right?
Yes.
Like imagine somebody talking about Rambo as pure as a virgin.
Yeah.
Or open-hearted as a child.
Yeah. Right.
But it fits so in line with the kind of American, the larger American ideal of the kind of manifest destiny, pure, superior, inevitable conquest.
And it's sanctifying, right?
Yeah, it's sanctifying and it's pure. It makes me think, we talked very briefly when we did that episode about Valley Forge and that picture of George Washington going into the woods, or that painting and that story and that myth of George Washington going into the woods and praying, and why that was so powerful for so many decades, even though he probably didn't actually do that. But the idea that our warriors are also sort of religious figures and pure figures in some way is really key here. So the spiritual side of it, for sure. It is also interesting that, like, when Grant and a little bit when Sherman and others get the first word of what happened, like, they do kind of say, like, I think Custer screwed up a little bit here, but it's like almost immediately overwhelmed by the myth. It doesn't take. And so you start to get like magazine, right, essayists and poets and speeches and so forth, just sort of painting this picture of Custer as this pure, martyred figure. And the flip side of that, of course, is that Reno kind of takes the fall for a lot of this. He comes back east. He has to testify about what went down. He has a very rocky sort of next chapter to his career. In 1880, Reno faces charges for striking a junior officer. He stays in the military, but he starts charges for striking a junior officer and for being a peeping Tom while drunk while on duty at Fort Meade in the Dakota Territory. He actually is buried in an unmarked grave at Glenwood Cemetery in Washington, D.C. And then many decades later, in the 1960s, his great-grandnephew tries to kind of get his body exhumed and buried at Little Bighorn at the battlefield in Montana. But, it shows that, like, for every sainted figure, there's also just all the other stuff that you have to kind of wipe away in order to have that pure story right at the center of it all.
Why would he want him exhumed and buried at the site at which it all, like, to me, it seems like we're going to have him put on the family plot. I don't know.
Or Arlington or something. But I don't know. It's just like...
Feels a little like he might be like, what? You buried me where?
Fair enough.
It's interesting. I mean, there was an inquiry into what happened, and everyone who came forward said that Reno was brave and courageous and was following orders and all of those things. But it just... Even all of that testimony and evidence couldn't rewrite the myth.
Yeah. So I want to do one sort of other element of the immediate fallout, but then really trace Custer's myth through the decades. So obviously, in the wake of this, it is a military defeat, and it is pretty, has a pretty big impact in the sort of immediate battles taking place in the Black Hills. But what it mostly does, from what I can tell, is it really like recommits the United States to this policy of Indian removal, and just the tactics become much more heavy-handed, much more violent, much more commitment of troops. And so in the end, it really does accelerate that genocide that's taking place on the Western Front.
And I also think it gives even more reason for them to be like, see, we're not putting enough behind it. We need to show that we're serious. And so you get an even more aggressive campaign to sort of like reclaim the name or reputation of the United States. It's like, we can't be bested by Native Americans. And I think that's also part of the shame or the stigma of the loss, is that like these valiant white heroes got bested by Native Americans, and that just was not tolerable for them.
And it justified the escalation of violence and violent tactics against the remaining Native peoples, right? The efforts to starve them off the land and into reservations. And I think it's also worth noting that both Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull are brought into U.S. custody at different points over the next few years, and both of them are killed in custody.
Yeah.
So they were killed by the U.S. state.
We did an episode
within just
on
a
that
few
too.
years.
Yeah.
Well, we did an episode about just the following year, sort of, yes, Sitting Bull is kind of on the run, and he actually takes a lot of his troops into Canada. And I remember doing that episode about kind of, he's continuing to negotiate, this escalation of violence, but then eventually, yes, they are captured and both die in captivity. But it is really, just to put a timetable on it, Custer's last stand is in late June of 1976. The sort of really big policy change, the Agreement of 1877, is passed in February of 1977. So, 6 months and change later. And that officially takes away Sioux land and permanently establishes Indian reservations. And that really just brings the hammer down in terms of U.S. policy and escalation. Okay. Let's turn a little bit to the myth of Custer. So, as we said, throughout the 1870s into the 1880s, he has this kind of like, one magazine editor called him chief among our nation's knights, Knights, But like the U.S. as a relatively young country is one that is sort of celebrating 100 years, I think is in need of these kind of like saintly figures. And I think Custer in many ways sort of enters that canon. He's not maybe a founding father level, but he's up there. But as we get into the 20th century, the way that Custer's myth is like revisited and contested, I think does some really interesting reflection of the kind of changing conversation about not just like the West and our relationship to native peoples, but just sort of American identity in general. And I feel like it's in the 1930s that you start to get a little bit more of a like criticism of the Custer himself, or the Custer myth a little bit.
Yes, and this is right at the moment when really like indigenous life has been destroyed in the United States. You're going to get some legislation in the 1930s during the New Deal to try to protect the remaining native peoples and to a certain extent a small amount of remaining native land. But it now is safe to turn a critical lens on Custer because they don't need him in that mythological role about the West and about native peoples anymore. And so it opens up the space for, for a biography of Custer that shows him to be just like a immature, foolish little man.
That said, in the 40s is when They Died with Their Boots On comes out, and that's the sort of like portrays a heroic, charismatic Custer. And funny enough,
when you need a war hero.
They need a war hero, and that movie is released just days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so, as we go into World War II, we certainly have the idea of the gallant, brave, fight to the last moment general playing out kind of in real time. And we also have that kind of myth-making plays into that as well. Then as we get into the 60s and the 70s, certainly, Custer gets revisited in many interesting ways. And in part because I think there is finally a sort of growing conversation about how we treated Native people as part of the larger civil rights conversation. And I also think post-Vietnam, there's just also a lot of that kind of question about kind of American military might and competence and so forth.
So,
and ethics.
Yes. And you get a real Red Power movement that is like changing the narrative on a lot of these heroes. Both Native American heroes are being amplified at the same time while these white generals are becoming vilified.
And it really is. I mean, once that reconsideration of indigenous peoples and the U.S. treaty policy, as that is all being inspected and gone over again, that's really the last moment that Custer was ever seen as a hero by the majority of Americans. After that, I think he is kind of put back into place either as a villain or just as someone who didn't deserve all of the acclamation
was foolish,
that had been piled on him.
No biopics, no movies.
Yeah. Though I do, so certainly, the Red Power movement is a huge part of this. And there's, stories from the 60s and 70s of Native American activists and people from the American Indian movement, disrupting memorial services and holding signs that say Custer died for your sins and sort of contesting that site of the battlefield. But I also just am really fascinated by, and I sort of know this mostly through kind of the movies of the late 70s or the mid and late 70s, and a lot of the Westerns that came out there, a lot of the Clint Eastwood Westerns that are kind of made in this post-Vietnam era where there is a real kind of like reckoning with just violence and brutality and an understanding. And, I should give a shout out here, I guess, to my guy, Richard Slotkin, who I took classes with at Wesleyan and wrote a lot about kind of both about films, but also just wrote about how the myth of the West so many times just stripped it of the brutality and the violence. Mm-hmm. And I think in the post-Vietnam era, that kind of gets introduced because we're thinking about it's the My Lai massacre. It's the way that we kind of behave, how our soldiers actually behave in real time when it's chaotic and bloody and brutal. And I think a lot of that gets injected back into the stories of the West.
It's so fascinating because those vigilante Western stories that used to be so celebrated in an earlier period, the Westerns become more complicated and the celebrated vigilante becomes an urban vigilante in the Dirty Harry movies and things like that. So it's an interesting shift.
Until Dances with Wolves. I feel like Kevin Costner, God bless him, but this man, I feel like that film changed the way, again, we saw this white hero, this great white man, as being able to come in and sort of broker this territory in a way that felt more humane and sentimental. And it sort of revived some of those sentiments that I think had been rightfully so put away.
Although interestingly, it was less about a white person versus savages and more about his proximity to the nobility of Native peoples is what gave him the ability to be the white savior in that movie.
Yeah. Okay, let's cut now to this year, 2026. So we've mentioned this many times on the show, but we are, of course, living in a moment now where the Trump administration in March of last year issued the Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History executive order, which had a lot to say about not just their vision of U.S. history, but also specifically the way that history is presented at sites, at historical sites. And actually, the Little Bighorn National Historical Monument was actually one of the sort of most contested areas in the sort of wake of this. So what has gone down at that site in Montana right now?
Well, first, just as background, that site had already been one of great contests. It took a lot of negotiation to get signs put up that told a different story than the Custer's Last Stand story. But you do eventually get broad signage that talks about Native peoples, talks about the broken promises to Native tribes, that talks about the destruction of indigenous culture and languages, about the boarding school system. So all of those signs had gone up, I think, in the 1990s, maybe a little later. But with this executive order, the National Park Service removed those signs because they told too negative of a story about U.S. history, and that would hurt some people's feelings.
I don't know what emotion is the best to sort of describe how I feel about this. I mean, in some sense, you can never take away that history, right? Sign or no sign, the people know what happened and how it went down, and not just with Custer, but with the boarding schools, with the destruction of language, with all of the broken treaties. That history just can't be erased with the removal of a sign. And on the other hand, I'm always worried about how we shape these stories and how the next generation will get this history. Is it a little bit more diluted? Is it a little bit more sort of erased or marginalized? And signs may seem superficial, but they're no small thing. And I think the moment you start to chip away at some of the symbolic changes that really point people in the direction of a more sort of nuanced history, something is lost. And you really have to fight to not just get that signage back, but to get those stories incorporated in part of sort of mainstream traditional curriculum and memory making, public memory making.
But even as just a purely like informational exercise, like I just don't understand. Like what are the 5 W's? Like who, what,
when,
where, why?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, you could stand there, and it seems to me like the effort here is to have the sign say who and what and when and where. But like, how could you not stand there and ask why? And the why is where you start to then just get an understanding for why did this battle take place. And then you have to talk about Indian policy, and you have to talk about boarding schools. You have to understand the gold and all that stuff. But, just like, I mean, I understand why it's contested, and I understand why is the hardest question of all those 5.
The biggest,
it's also the most important.
Yes,
yeah, exactly. But to expect that people aren't going to have that question and that you shouldn't address it in some way is just silly, to your point, Kelly. Like, it doesn't change anything. That history is there, and people are going to find out and tell those stories regardless, So, yeah. Okay. Well, we've talked a lot about movies and books and so forth. Maybe people should watch some of those complicated Westerns of the 70s and read some Richard Slotkin and go visit the site. But anything else on your mind as we talk about kind of how to remember this or mark this?
Man, I would love to see. And this is, we have so many stories of the Great White Hope, the Great White Savior, but I really would love to see an Indigenous film that centers Indigenous agency, that tells like sort of like the biopic of your Sitting Bull, your Crazy Horse, make it complicated, make it messy, make it like very Native centric. Like I would love to see more films, more TV shows like that. I think sometimes it gets really hard to tell these stories without having a white center. And I want more of that. I really do.
And I wonder too, Kelly, if it were truly Indigenous storytelling, if it might not even center Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. It might look different.
It might be about the woman that threw a rock that hit Custer in the head.
Or it might not be so much focused on individuals. It'd be really, I mean, I just think it would be such an interesting experience, and somebody should give a lot of money to it.
Yeah. And obviously a very different part of the world and a very different era. But, there was that Killers of the Flower Moon that Scorsese directed, which I think was very much like trying to explode some of the way in which these stories were told. And to your point, Nikki, that film was told not just from the Native perspective, but it didn't sort of center like one character as the one around, it was just sort of a portrait of a community and a people. And I thought that was, well done. But yes, many more. There should be many more. I will say, as we were prepping for this, our producer Jacob pointed out that The Rest is History, which is a podcast I listen to religiously and I adore, did an 11-part series on this and Custer's West End. And I was looking at the prep and I told Jacob, I was like, I listened to all 11 parts of that last year and I don't remember a single thing. So, I hope that doesn't happen with ours. But I remember it being very good and I remember really enjoying it. And I went back and listened to part of it and it sort of jogged my memory again. But when we're talking about sort of like work that I think really paints the nuance here, I do recommend that 11-part
Yes, I love a good deep dive. I love a good like binge-worthy podcast that you can.
But it was amazing where I was like, I couldn't tell you a single thing. When I read, when I started to brush up and read the prep, it came back a little.
Felt familiar.
But I hope it made me think a little bit about how people listen to this podcast. And,
there's no pop quiz, thank God.
Yeah, exactly.
Still room for history teachers in this world.
Yeah. All right. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia, a network of independent, artist-produced, listener-supported podcasts. Don't forget to sign up for our America 250 Watch newsletter. Every Thursday, you'll get exclusive access to analysis and information about the semi-quincentennial, commentary from our team, and a list of fascinating things that happened that week throughout history. And on Sundays, for our paid subscribers, you get early, ad-free access to our 50 Weeks That Shaped America series, plus other bonus conversations throughout the year. Join in, find out lots more, support the show at thisdaypod.com. You can also follow This Day Pod on Instagram, Blue Sky, and on YouTube. Get in touch with ideas or feedback at thisdaypod@gmail.com. Jacob Feldman is our researcher. Kala Nakua does our transcripts. Special thanks to Audrey Martovich, Yuri Lasordo, and everyone at Radiotopia. Extra special thanks to you for listening, subscribing, rating and reviewing, and telling others about the show. My name is Jody Avirgan. We'll see you soon.